Thomas Stearns Eliot OM was an American-born British essayist, publisher, playwright, literary and social critic, and one of the 20th century's major poets. He moved to England in 1914 at age 25, settling, working and marrying there. He was eventually naturalised as a British subject in 1927 at age 39, renouncing his American citizenship. Eliot attracted widespread attention for his poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which is seen as a masterpiece of the modernist movement. It was followed by some of the best-known poems in the English language, including The Waste Land, The Hollow Men, Ash Wednesday, and Four Quartets. He is also known for his 7 plays, particularly Murder in the Cathedral. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1948 for his outstanding, pioneer contribution to present-day poetry. Early life and education. The Eliots were a Boston family with roots in Eldon, New England. Thomas Eliot's paternal grandfather, William Greenleaf Eliot, had moved to St. Louis, Missouri to establish a Unitarian Christian church there. His father, Henry Ware Eliot, was a successful businessman, president and treasurer of the hydraulic press brick company in St. Louis. His mother, Charlotte Champe Stearns, wrote poetry and was a social worker, a new profession in the early 20th century. Eliot was the last of 6 surviving children. His parents were both 44 years old when he was born. Eliot was born at 2635 Locust Street, property owned by his grandfather, William Greenleaf Eliot. His 4 sisters were between 11 and 19 years older. His brother was 8 years older. Known to family and friends as Tom, he was the namesake of his maternal grandfather, Thomas Stearns. Eliot's childhood infatuation with literature can be ascribed to several factors. First, he had to overcome physical limitations as a child. Struggling from a congenital double inguinal hernia, he could not participate in many physical activities and thus was prevented from socializing with his peers. As he was often isolated, his love for literature developed. Once he learned to read, the young boy immediately became obsessed with books and was absorbed in tales depicting savages, the Wild West, or Mark Twain's thrill-seeking Tom Sawyer. In his memoir of Eliot, his friend Robert Sencourt comments that the young Eliot would often curl up in the window seat behind an enormous book, setting the drug of dreams against the pain of living. Secondly, Eliot credited his hometown with fueling his literary vision. It is self-evident that St. Louis affected me more deeply than any other environment has ever done. I feel that there is something in having passed one's childhood beside the big river, which is incommunicable to those people who have not. I consider myself fortunate to have been born here, rather than in Boston, or New York, or London. From 1898 to 1905, Eliot attended Smith Academy, where his studies included Latin, Ancient Greek, French, and German. He began to write poetry when he was 14 under the influence of Edward Fitzgerald's Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a translation of the poetry of Omar Khayyam. He said the results were gloomy and despairing and he destroyed them. His first published poem, A Fable for Feasters, was written as a school exercise and was published in the Smith Academy Record in February 1905. Also published there in April 1905 was his oldest surviving poem in manuscript, an entitled Lyric, later revised and reprinted as Song in the Harvard Advocate, Harvard University's student magazine. He also published 3 short stories in 1905, Birds of Prey, A Tale of a Whale, and The Man Who Was King. The last mentioned story significantly reflects his exploration of Igorot village while visiting the 1904 World's Fair of St. Louis. Such a link with primitive people importantly antedates his anthropological studies at Harvard. Eliot lived in St. Louis, Missouri for the first 16 years of his life at the house on Locust Street where he was born. After going away to school in 1905, he only returned to St. Louis for vacations and visits. Despite moving away from the city, Eliot wrote to a friend that the Missouri and the Mississippi have made a deeper impression on me than any other part of the world. Following graduation, Eliot attended Milton Academy in Massachusetts for a preparatory year, where he met Schofield Thayer, who would later publish The Waste Land. He studied philosophy at Harvard College from 1906 to 1909, earning his bachelor's degree after 3 years, instead of the usual 4. While a student, Eliot was placed on academic probation and graduated with a pass degree. He recovered and persisted, attaining a B.A. in an elective program best described as comparative literature in 3 years, and an M.A. in English literature in the 4th. Frank Kermode writes that the most important moment of Eliot's undergraduate career was in 1908 when he discovered Arthur Symons's The Symbolist movement in literature. This introduced him to Jules Laforgue, Arthur Rimbaud, and Paul Verlaine. Without Verlaine, Eliot wrote, he might never have heard of Tristan Corbière and his book Les Amours Journes, a work that affected the course of Eliot's life. The Harvard Advocate published some of his poems, and he became lifelong friends with Conrad Aiken, the American novelist. After working as a philosophy assistant at Harvard from 1909 to 1910, Eliot moved to Paris where, from 1910 to 1911, he studied philosophy at the Sorbonne. He attended lectures by Henry Bergson and read poetry with Henry Alban Fournier. From 1911 to 1914, he was back at Harvard studying Indian philosophy and Sanskrit. Eliot was awarded a scholarship to Merton College, Oxford, in 1914. He first visited Marburg, Germany, where he planned to take a summer program. But when the First World War broke out, he went to Oxford instead. At the time, so many American students attended Merton that the Junior Common Room proposed a motion that this society abhors the Americanization of Oxford. It was defeated by 2 votes after Eliot reminded the students how much they owed American culture. Eliot wrote to Conrad Aiken on New Year's Eve 1914, I hate university towns and university people who are of the same everywhere, with pregnant wives, sprawling children, many books and hideous pictures on the walls. Oxford is very pretty, but I don't like to be dead. Escaping Oxford, Eliot spent much of his time in London. This city had a monumental and life-altering effect on Eliot for multiple reasons, the most significant of which was his introduction to the influential American literary figure Ezra Pound. A connection through Aiken resulted in an arranged meeting, and on the 22nd of September 1914, Eliot paid a visit to Pound's flat. Pound instantly deemed Eliot worth watching, and was crucial to Eliot's beginning career as a poet, as he is credited with promoting Eliot through social events and literary gatherings. Thus, according to biographer John Worthen, during his time in England, Eliot was seeing as little of Oxford as possible. He was instead spending long periods of time in London, in the company of Ezra Pound and some of the modern artists whom the war has so far spared. It was Pound who helped most, introducing him everywhere. In the end, Eliot did not settle at Merton and left after a year. In 1915, he taught English at Birkbeck, University of London. By 1916, he had completed a doctoral dissertation for Harvard on knowledge and experience in the philosophy of F.H. Bradley, but he failed to return for the viva voce exam. Marriage. In a letter to Aiken late in December 1914, Eliot, aged 26, wrote, I am very dependent upon women. Less than 4 months later, her. Thayer introduced Eliot to Vivian Hayward, a Cambridge governess. They were married at Hampstead Register Office on the 26th of June 1915. After a short visit alone to his family in the United States, Eliot returned to London and took several teaching jobs, such as lecturing at Birkbeck College, University of London. The philosopher Bertrand Russell took an interest in Vivian while the newlyweds stayed in his flat. Some scholars have suggested that she and Russell had an affair, but the allegations were never confirmed. The marriage was markedly unhappy, in part because of Vivian's health issues. In a letter addressed to Ezra Pound, she covers an extensive list of her symptoms, which included a habitually high temperature, fatigue, insomnia, migraines, and colitis. This, coupled with apparent mental instability, meant that she was often sent away by Eliot and her doctors for extended periods of time in the hope of improving her health, and as time went on, he became increasingly detached from her. The couple formally separated in 1933, and in 1938 Vivian's brother, Maurice, had her committed to a lunatic asylum against her will, where she remained until her death of heart disease in 1947. The relationship became the subject of a 1984 play Tom and Amp Viv, which in 1994 was adapted as a film. In a private paper written in his 60s, Eliot confessed, "I came to persuade myself that I was in love with Vivian simply because I wanted to burn my boats and commit myself to staying in England, and she persuaded herself that she would save the poet by keeping him in England." To her, the marriage brought no happiness. To me, it brought the state of mind out of which came the wasteland. Teaching Lloyd's, Faber and Faber. After leaving Merton, Eliot worked as a schoolteacher, most notably at Highgate School, a private school in London, where he taught French and Latin. His students included the young John Betjeman. Later he taught at the Royal Grammar School, High Wycombe, a state school in Buckinghamshire. To earn extra money, he wrote book reviews and lectured at evening extension courses. In 1917, he took a position at Lloyds Bank in London, working on foreign accounts. On a trip to Paris in August 1920 with the artist Wyndham Lewis, he met the writer James Joyce. Eliot said he found Joyce arrogant. Joyce doubted Eliot's ability as a poet at the time, but the two soon became friends, with Eliot visiting Joyce whenever he was in Paris. Eliot and Wyndham Lewis also maintained a close friendship, leading to Lewis's later making his well-known portrait painting of Eliot in 1938. Charles Whibley recommended T.S. Eliot to Geoffrey Faber. In 1925 Eliot left Lloyd's to join the publishing firm Faber & Guire, later Faber & Faber, where he remained for the rest of his career, eventually becoming a director. At Faber & Faber, he was responsible for publishing important English poets like W.H. Auden, Stephen Spender, and Ted Hughes. Conversion to Anglicanism and British citizenship. On the 29th of June 1927, Eliot converted to Anglicanism from Unitarianism, and in November that year he took British citizenship. He became a warden of his parish church, St Stephen's, Gloucester Road, London, and a life member of the Society of King Charles the Martyr. He specifically identified as Anglo-Catholic, proclaiming himself classicist in literature, royalist in politics, and Anglo-Catholic in religion. About 30 years later, Eliot commented on his religious views that he combined a Catholic cast of mind, a Calvinist heritage, and a puritanical temperament. He also had wider spiritual interests, commenting that, "I see the path of progress for modern man in his occupation with his own self, with his inner being," and citing Goethe and Rudolf Steiner as exemplars of such a direction. One of Eliot's biographers, Peter Ackroyd, commented that the purposes of were twofold. 1. The Church of England offered Eliot some hope for himself, and I think Eliot needed some resting place. But secondly, it attached Eliot to the English community and English culture. separation and remarriage. By 1932, Eliot had been contemplating a separation from his wife for some time, when Harvard offered him the Charles Eliot Norton Professorship for the 1932-1933 academic year. He accepted and left Vivian in England. Upon his return, he arranged for a formal separation from her, avoiding all but one meeting with her between his leaving for America in 1932 and her death in 1947. Vivian was committed to the Northumberland House Mental Hospital, Stoke Newington, in 1938, and remained there until she died. Although Eliot was still legally her husband, he never visited her. From 1938 to 1957, Eliot's public companion was Mary Trevelyan of London University, who wanted to marry him and left a detailed memoir. From 1946 to 1957, Eliot shared a flat with his friend John Davy Hayward, who collected and managed Eliot's papers, styling himself keeper of the Eliot Archive. Hayward also collected Eliot's pre-proofread verse, commercially published after Eliot's death as poems written in early youth. When Eliot and Hayward separated the household in 1957, Hayward retained his collection of Eliot's papers, which he bequeathed to King's College, Cambridge, in 1965. On the 10th of January 1957, at the age of 68, Eliot married Esme Valerie Fletcher, who was 30. In contrast to his first marriage, Eliot knew Fletcher well, as she had been his secretary at Faber & Faber since August 1949. They kept the wedding secret. The ceremony was held in a church at 6:15 a.m., with virtually no one in attendance other than his wife's parents. Eliot had no children with either of his wives. In the early 1960s, by then in failing health, Eliot worked as an editor for the Wesleyan University Press, seeking new poets in Europe for publication. After Eliot's death, Valerie dedicated her time to preserving his legacy, by editing and annotating the letters of T.S. Eliot on a facsimile of the draft of The Waste Land. Valerie Eliot died on the 9th of November 2012 at her home in London. Death and honours. Eliot died of emphysema at his home in Kensington, in London, on the 4th of January 1965, and was cremated at Golders Green Crematorium. In accordance with his wishes, his ashes were taken to St Michael and All Angels Church, East Coker, the village in Somerset from which his Eliot ancestors had emigrated to America. A wall plaque commemorates him with a quotation from his poem, East Coker, "In my beginning is my end. In my end is my beginning." In 1967, on the second anniversary of his death, Eliot was commemorated by the installation of a large stone in the floor of Poets' Corner in London's Westminster Abbey. The stone, cut by designer Reynolds Stone, is inscribed with his life dates, his order of merit, and a quotation from his poem, Little Gidding. The communication of the dead is tongued with fire beyond the language of the living. The house where he died, No. 3 Kensington Court Gardens, has had a blue plaque on it since 1986.